Thank you, Senator Rubio. I've always been impressed with your view, particularly on a 50,000-foot level, of the kind of problems that we face in our lane and national security lane, foreign relations and intelligence. So appreciate those remarks. We're now going to start a round. I'm going to allow 10-minute questions since this is a cabinet-level position. That doesn't mean you have to use all 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes are there. And what I'm going to do in this hearing and what I'm going to do in future hearings is I will call on people based on seniority on the committee at the time the gavel goes down. And if you come after that, you'll be put in line after that, and we'll go down the list like that. In any event, with that, Senator Rubio, could you talk for a minute about the Russian energy reliance? I think all of us were impressed when the war started that the Europeans knew the necessity of cutting the cord with Russia on their reliance on Russian energy, which had developed since the Iron Curtain came down, all of us believing that Russia would behave itself, which turned out to be a very misplaced view. And now, with the war carrying on, it's going to end, obviously, at some point in time. There are voices in Europe saying, well, we can go back to using Russian energy. My view is that that's not reasonable and it's not appropriate. And indeed, I think that the fallout from this war is going to go on for generations. Your thoughts on the energy relationship between Europe and Russia in the future?
Well, I'm reminded, I believe back in 2018, then President Trump, on two occasions, once at the United Nations and I think another time at a NATO conference, pointed, for example, to Germany's reliance on Russian energy as a real vulnerability. And he was snickered at. I remember he was snickered at by the representatives of Germany at the United Nations. He turned out to be 100% correct. In fact, that reliance on Russian energy was a major loss of deterrence. Vladimir Putin, among his many calculations, one of the calculations he took in going in Ukraine was that the Europeans would complain. Maybe they'd hit him with a couple sanctions. They'd write some strongly worded, nasty letters about him, but ultimately would not be able to do anything effectively because of how much they depended on Russia. And in some cases continue to depend. I believe France is the third leading payer into Russian energy in the world, and I think a couple other countries in Europe follow right behind. So there's still a significant amount of dependence in that regard. And that dependence on Russian energy is a tremendous amount of leverage that Vladimir Putin holds on his neighbors in Europe. Now, there is some good news. I think, for example, I watched with great interest the German engineering marvel, where they've been able to, I think by the end of this year, after they waived permitting requirements, and within 9 months, were able to open what is literally a floating LNG terminal to allow and receive exports, including from the United States and other places. So I do think you're seeing movement in Europe now to try to detangle itself from that level of dependence, but it remains a real vulnerability and a tremendous piece of leverage for Putin against his neighbors in the broader world. It's also a reminder, by the way, and I used to be guilty of saying this quite a bit, that the Russian GDP was the size of Italy's, not very large. I think one of the things we learned from this endeavor is that it's not just the size of the GDP, but what it's composed of. And the Russian GDP, while smaller than some other countries, is largely reliant on the production of raw materials, on the energy, on food production, fertilizer and the like. And these are critical components of national strength and a reminder of how important they are for us here domestically as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do think, too, we ought to acknowledge that the Europeans did a job that was well beyond their expectations the first winter. As they struggled through, they did really well as far as cutting the cord with Russia, being as how hard they were tied to that. Let's talk about AUKUS for a minute. There hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS. Well, there hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS really since the thing started. A lot of us have been pressing the administration to gear that up. It has not been forthcoming. I'd like to hear your thoughts on AUKUS, the importance thereof, and getting this thing moving as it was intended.
Well, one of the things we'll have to endeavor to see, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of this that relies on the Department of Defense and other entities in government. To the extent the Secretary of State and the Department of State is engaged, it's something that I think you're going to find very strong support for in this administration, because it's one of, I think it's almost a blueprint in many ways of how we can create consortium-like partnership with nation states that are allied to us to confront some of these global challenges, be it in the defense realm, in the technology realm, in the critical minerals realm, in the sensitive technologies and critical technologies on, for example, artificial intelligence and advances in even quantum computing. This obviously is more defense related, but it's one example of how we can leverage the power of these partnerships with allies, 2-3 countries in some cases, broader in others, to reach outcomes and objectives, such as creating a geopolitical and strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So we'll have to look at that and to see what components of whatever impediments exist can be removed by the action of the Department of State. But it also reminds us that in many of these, very few of these global issues are entirely reliant on the Department of State. The Department of Energy, the Department of Defense. We have a host of other government agencies, commerce in many cases, who also play a critical role in expediting and going through, for example, some of the lists of technologies that perhaps are not being transferred because they've been deemed as sensitive. But in the case of our strong and close allies, that's the point, right? Is that you want to be able to find yourself in a situation where you can accelerate partnership by making available to key allies these sensitive technologies that we wouldn't want to see in the hands or developed by an adversary or unaligned country.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And our view is aligned, particularly on the excluded technology list. These are our closest and most trusted allies. And unfortunately, the current administration has really been difficult to work with as far as getting through that excluded technology list. And I hope you'll help expedite that. Let me talk for a minute about the International Criminal Court. Look, as you know, we've got real problems there. The court originally was intended, at least from our point of view, to be a court that focused on international crimes that were committed by people from countries who did not have a robust democracy nor a robust judicial system that held its own people accountable for crimes. The court's gone beyond that, obviously. They are not only focusing on people who aren't accountable elsewhere, but they're also focusing on people who come from countries that solve their own problems, like the United States of America and like Israel. The most recent obvious thing that flowed from that was the indictment on the same day of Netanyahu plus a Hamas character. Any court that is a court of law has to be able to recognize good from bad. And when you try to indict two people and show some type of moral equivalency in that regard, they're just barking up the wrong tree. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to rein them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the ICC has done tremendous damage to its global credibility. First of all, it is going after a non-member state on the claims that I believe, in fact, I think just in the last 24 hours, the Israeli High Court filed an appeal before the ICC, even though it's not a member state. And I saw some of the filings from the prosecutor, Mr. Khan, who's involved in that process. And he argues that they have the right to go after non-members for their activities within the confines of member states in this case. And I think, first of all, the whole premise of his prosecution is flawed, beyond the process of it and the precedent that it sets, which is a very dangerous precedent for the United States of America, by the way, because this is a test run. This is a trial run to see, can we go after a head of state from a nation that's not a member? If we can go after them and we can get it done with regards to Israel, they will apply that to the United States at some point. And in fact, there have been threats to do so in the past. But the premise of the prosecution itself is completely and utterly flawed. As you said, they went ahead, I think they also went after Sinwar. Well, number one, Sinwar didn't travel around the world. He's not with us any longer. But he didn't travel around the world, was at no risk of being apprehended. Second of all, the moral equivalency piece of it was offensive. Let me explain, and I think I don't need to explain to this committee. Hamas carried out an atrocious operation. They sent a bunch of savages into Israel with the express and explicit purpose of targeting civilians. They went into concerts. They went into these music festivals. They knew that there were no soldiers at the music festival. They knew that these were teenagers and young families, that they went into different communities and the kibbutzes and the like, and they deliberately targeted civilians. Deliberately. It was in fact, they kidnapped the ones they didn't murder, the families who they didn't eviscerate, the people whose skulls they didn't crack open. They kidnapped, and to this day continue to hold people, innocents that they took, a deliberate operation. In the case of Israel, responding to that attack has had to go after Hamas. How can you coexist? How can any nation state on the planet coexist side by side with a group of savages like Hamas? They have to defend their national security and their national interest, as I pointed out in my opening statement. And so there is no more, and they didn't target civilians. Now, sadly and unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further, some of the other questions that will come up here today, one of the horrible things about war, it's a terrible thing about war, and it's why we should try to prevent it at almost any cost, is that innocent people are caught up in it. And that's true of every conflict on the planet. But there is a difference between those who, in the conduct of armed action, deliberately target civilians, and those who do as much as they can to avoid civilians being caught up against an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, against an enemy that hides in tunnels, against an enemy that hides behind women and children and puts them at the forefront and uses them as human shields. That's who Hamas is. There is no moral equivalency, and I think the ICC, if they don't drop this, will find its credibility globally badly damaged, and I think the United States should be very concerned, because I believe this is a test run for applying it to American service members and American leaders in the future.
Well said. I couldn't agree with you more. And certainly the court has badly damaged its reputation, and it's going to have a long ways to go